Chapter 3. The Start of the Trail. The sun was still bright and the smell of the sea was in the air as Willy Wolf walked into Skagway. He slowly walked past stores which were selling groceries, equipment and clothes. He saw restaurants filled with hungry people and tents crowded with loud men who were drinking beer and playing cards. In some places, men stood in the street next to piles of supplies and argued about the price of carrying loads up to trails and into the mountains. Some men offered to carry supplies on their backs. Others offered horses for sale. Willy looked around the busy street and wondered which way his father and uncle had gone. There were so many people passing through Skagway that he knew he would be very lucky to find someone who had seen and remembered the Wolf brothers. Perhaps if he learned more about the trails, he could guess which route his father and uncle had chosen. Willy put his hand into his pocket and felt the $50 which Erickson had given him. It was more than he had earned, he knew. His friend had been kind. The money felt good in his hand and it made him feel brave. He also felt very hungry, and there was a tent nearby with a long line of men who were waiting to buy food. Something smelled good, so Willy stepped into the tent. At the back of the tent, a short man in a dirty white shirt was filling bowls with hot food. Behind the man was a sign with black letters that said, "Beef, stew, bread, coffee, 50 cents. While Willy was reading the sign, a pair of loud men pushed into the tent behind him. One of the men ran into Willy and almost knocked him down. However, the man's friend grabbed Willy's arm from behind and pulled him back. "Sorry, kid," the first man said. Then the two men left the tent and disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. 5 minutes later, Willy reached the front of the line. His stomach was making hungry noises. He reached into his pocket to pay for a bowl of stew. His pocket was empty. A terrible feeling grew in Willy as he quickly searched all of his pockets. Nothing. All of his money was gone. The man who had run into him. "Hey kid," the man in line behind him roughly spoke. "Are you going to eat or not?" Willy turned and looked wildly at the man. Then he ran out of the tent and down the street. He pushed people out of the way, not seeing where he was going. Suddenly he crashed into a large man who he could push to the side. "Hold on," the man cried. He grabbed Willy's shoulder. "Where are you going, young man?" He let go of Willy, who stepped back and wiped his eyes. Willy saw that the stranger was wearing a uniform, but it was not a uniform that he had seen before. The man saw the boy's confused expression and smiled. "Colonel Sam Steele," he said, holding out a large hand. "Canadian Mounted Police. Now tell me, what's your name? And why are you in such a hurry?" Half an hour later, Willy was sitting in a restaurant and talking quickly while he ate hungrily from a big bowl of stew. Colonel Steele drank coffee while he listened. His face looked serious. "There's no question about it, Willy. It was the work of Soapy Smith's gang," Steele said. "Smith is the king of thieves in Skagway. He and his gang control this town. They steal from the stampeders in Skagway and along the trails into Canada. I came here to discuss the problem with the American police, but there aren't enough of them here to fight Soapy Smith. What happened to you is one of his gang's tricks. Smith's men often work in pairs. They probably followed you all the way from the beach after they saw your friend give you the money. They are probably dividing your money with Smith right now." Willy looked up. "What can I do, Colonel Steele?" he asked. "I'm in trouble without that money." "I don't know how I can help you, Willy. I don't have any power outside of Canada," Steele said. "I wish I did. I'm sorry, but I don't think you will see your $50 again." No one spoke for a moment. When Steele spoke again, his voice was soft. "You aren't 17, are you, Willy?" The Mountie asked. "That's all right. You don't have to answer, but it seems to me that your friend Erickson gave you some good advice. You made a lot of money on the trip up here. If it's money you want, you'll make more on the ships which sail between here and Seattle than most of these stampeders are going to find in the Klondike. I've been there, Willy. I know what I'm talking about." Willy looked into his almost empty bowl. Steele went on. "If you don't decide to go after your dad, I think you should look for him on the Chilkoot Trail. Most people who are starting out now are trying to get through Chilkoot Pass. The route is very steep, but it's shorter than the White Pass Trail. They hope to get as far as they can before the cold weather freezes their rivers and lakes. That will stop most travel until spring. Your uncle and dad could be on one or the other trail, of course, but I would guess they are on the Chilkoot." Steele paused again to drink some coffee. "One thing I will tell you, Willy. Don't stay in Skagway. There are dangers along the trail, but you will find people there who will help each other. Here in town, everyone is afraid of Soapy Smith. I've met lots of bad men in my work, but Soapy Smith is one of the worst. There aren't many United States police officers here yet, and Smith and his gang control things. Until that changes, things in Skagway will only become more dangerous. When he had finished his coffee, Colonel Sam Steele of the Mounted Police put $5 on the table in front of Willie. He then stood up and walked outside. Willie followed. The two shook hands, wished each other luck, and walked in different directions. An hour later, Willie was sitting on a log and looking across the blue-gray water. A boat was coming towards the shore. It was the ferry between Skagway and Diese, the town at the start of the Chilkoot Trail. The ferry was busy today. Willie watched as the boat tied up at the dock. A small group of passengers got off and walked into Skagway. On the dock, a pretty girl about Willie's age and a young man who was a little older than Willie stood next to a large pile of supplies. They were talking with the ferry captain. The captain shook his head and began to argue. "I can't carry it all in one trip," the ferry captain said. "You are not the only passengers there, and it's more cargo than just yours. You'll have to leave some of it here and come back for it." "We can't leave the cargo here without someone to watch it," young man said angrily. "And if my sister stays here to watch it, who will watch the supplies in Diese while I come back?" Willie got off the log and walked towards the group. "Can I help?" he asked. "I would be happy to watch your things. Are you taking all of this to Diese?" "Actually, we are taking it to Sheep Camp," the boy said. "That's 30 miles up the Chilkoot Trail." "Our mother has a restaurant there," said the girl. "My name is Lucy Stewart, and this is my brother Jack. Hi, I'm Willie Wolf." "We could use your help, Willie," said Jack, "and we can pay you. But how do we know we can trust you? We don't know you." "You can take this with you," said Willie as he gave Jack the cloth bag on his shoulder. "There isn't much in it, but it's everything I have." "Okay then, I'll give you $2 to watch your supplies while Lucy and I take the first load to Diese," Jack said. "If you help us get it all the way to Sheep Camp, I'll give you another $8 plus the best meal you can get on the Chilkoot Trail." The three young people worked quickly to load half of their supplies onto the ferry. Jack shook hands with Willie and Lucy smiled a warm smile. The three new friends waved at each other as the ferry left the dock and sailed across the dark water. An hour later, with all the cargo in Diese, Willie lifted the backpack filled with supplies onto his back. He took the reins of a horse that was also loaded with cargo and got in line behind Lucy. She was carrying a backpack that was only a little lighter than Willie's. She followed her brother, who was carrying the heaviest backpack and was also loading a horse. Trail Street, the main route through Diese, looked to Willie very much like Skagway. Rough, new wooden buildings stood next to white tents that flapped in the wind. There were hotels and restaurants and many stores with supplies for stampeders. Shouts of excitement filled the air. North of Diese, the trail followed the Taya River, which flowed down from Chilkoot Pass. The first few miles on the trail were quite flat, and Willie, Lucy and Jack were strong. They soon reached Finnegan's Point, 4 miles from Diese. "The trail crosses the river here," Jack explained to Willie. "The Finnegan family has built a little wooden bridge. It costs $1 for each of us to cross. Old Finnegan is making a lot of money with this bridge. But don't worry, I'll pay. There's a small camp on the other side. We can rest there and eat a little." A few minutes later, Willie took a bite of an apple while Lucy cut bread and cheese for a snack. While they ate, Willie, Lucy and Jack told each other about their families. The Stewarts were from Minnesota, where Lucy and Jack had been born on a farm. Their father had died in an accident 2 years ago, and after that their mother could not run the farm. Mary Stewart and their children moved to Seattle, where Mary's older sister lived. "But how did you get there?" Willie asked. "How did you get to Chilkoot Trail?" "My mother and aunt both worked in a restaurant in Seattle," Jack explained. "My mother cooked and my aunt ordered supplies and ran the business. When the stampede started, they decided to open a restaurant in Skagway. But then we saw what Skagway is like. Do you know who Soapy Smith is?" Willie nodded but said nothing. "Well, they decided to move out onto the trail," Jack said. "Sheep Camp seemed like a good place for a restaurant, and ours is the best one there. It's called the Gold Nugget." "Our aunt got sick about a month ago," Lucy said. "She went back to Seattle. She's better now." My mother writes to her and she sends us food and supplies. She sent the things that we are carrying today. You'll see the restaurant tomorrow, Willie. Sheep camp is a rough place, but it is growing and changing fast. And it's really exciting to be a part of this stampede. Well, I'm glad you find it exciting, Lucy, Jack said with a smile. Now let's get going. We'll camp at Canyon City tonight and finish our trip tomorrow. The Chilkoot Trail slowly rose over the next few miles. Lucy and Willie talked as they walked. Willie learned that Lucy was 14 while her brother was 17. Jack wanted very much to follow the trail to the Klondike, Lucy said, but he couldn't leave his mother and younger sister along in sheep camp. In the late afternoon, Willie, Lucy and Jack reached the entrance to a small canyon. A little town had grown there, called Canyon City. They put up a tent on the edge of the town and spent a quiet night of rest, talk and sleep. The next morning, after breakfast, they loaded the horse and put on their backpacks once again. The trail became narrow and steep as it climbed through the canyon. Willie's backpack began to feel very heavy, but he didn't want Lucy or Jack to know. At the top of the canyon, the three of them stopped and rested and admired the view of the mountains around them. The trail then rose gently for the last few miles that led to sheep camp. When they reached town, the Gold Nugget restaurant was crowded with people eating lunch, while Jack and Lucy unloaded the horses and carried the supplies into the restaurant's storeroom. For the rest of the afternoon, the three young people worked in and around the Gold Nugget. Dinner that night was as large and delicious as Jack had promised. The three new friends laughed and joked as they ate. After dinner, Jack gave Willie a blanket and helped him clear space in the storeroom where he could sleep. As he relaxed on the floor, Willie thought about all that had happened since he had left Seattle. Here he was in sheep camp, halfway between Diese and Chilkoot Pass. Of course, the rest of the trail to the pass was the steep and difficult part. He had little money and no outfit. He didn't know where his father and uncle were or even which trail they were on. Still, the last few days had been exciting. He had been unfortunate because he had been robbed, but he had also been very lucky to meet Jack and Lucy. Willie smiled as he fell asleep. He dreamed that he was walking the Chilkoot Trail. In Willie's dream, Lucy Stewart was walking next to him. Chapter 4. Sheep Camp. It was dark outside when Willie woke up in the morning. He could hear the noises of pots and pans in the restaurant kitchen next to the storeroom where he had slept. He got up and folded his blanket. When Willie walked into the kitchen, Mary Stewart turned and smiled. "Good morning," she said. "Did you sleep well?" "Oh yes, ma'am," Willie answered. "I hope you like pancakes," Mrs. Stewart said. She picked up a plate and a fork and gave them to Willie. "Jack and Lucy are in the dining room," she said. Jack was finishing a pancake when Willie walked into the room. On the table in front of Jack was a plate with a big pile of pancakes. Willie sat down beside Jack. The older boy put a fork into a large pancake and put the pancake on Willie's plate. Then he took another one for himself. Lucy sat across the table from her brother. "Good morning, Willie," she said. She poured a glass of milk and pushed it across the table toward her guest. "Good morning, Lucy." "Thanks, both of you," Willie said. "Say, what time is it?" 5 o'clock. "We let you sleep late," said Jack with a grin. "The restaurant opens at 5:30, Lucy explained. "There will be a hungry crowd here soon." Willie poured syrup on his pancake. He took a bite. "This is delicious," he said. He asked the stewards about their life in sheep camp. Willie ate 4 pancakes while they talked. Lucy told him she often worked in the kitchen and in the dining room with her mother. Jack worked in the dining room too, but he also brought water from the Tire River each day and did errands around sheep camp. Every 2 weeks, Jack went to Diese or Skagway to get supplies. Lucy sometimes went with him. "It takes a lot of work to run this restaurant," Lucy said. "After my aunt returned to Seattle, we hired a cook to help my mother. But the cook left last week. He had gold fever. He wanted to go to the Klondike. Now I'm afraid that mother is working too hard. I think she's getting tired." "Who do you think is tired?" asked Mary Stewart as she walked into the dining room. She laughed and put her hand on Lily's head. "Willie," he said, "Jack promised you $10 for your help. Here it is. What do you plan to do now?" "I don't know, ma'am," Willie said. "I really want to find my father and Uncle Al, but I'm not sure where to look." "They might be on Bennett Lake," Lucy said. "Even if they went through White Pass, I would bet that's where they are now. There are thousands of stampeders camped on the lake. They are building boats so they can travel down the Yukon River to the Klondike. Most of them will be there all winter. Lucy's right, Jack agreed. It's 500 miles by water from Bennett Lake to the Klondike, but the lakes and streams will be frozen soon. Most stampeders will have to wait until spring to go to the Klondike. If you can reach Bennett Lake before spring, perhaps you will find your father and uncle there. But I will need an outfit to get into Canada, Willie said. How will I get one? Maybe I should get a job on a steamship again, he said. I could earn some money and buy an outfit. If it's work that you want, why not work here? Mary Stuart asked. I will pay you $30 a week and give you meals and a place to sleep. You will make enough money to buy an outfit in a few months, Jack said. You could be on Bennett Lake early next year. I'll help you to carry your supplies. Me too, said Lily. We can help each other, Willie. And you can learn more about the trail while you work in sheep camp. Willie looked at the three stewards. He grinned. I guess the Gold Nugget restaurant has a new worker, he said. What do you want me to do? First, write a letter to your mother, Mrs. Stewart said. She'll be worried. Tell her where you are. Tell her you are all right. Then get some water with Jack. And I'll need wood for the stove today. Lucy, I need your help in the kitchen. Let's get started, everyone. The weather had been sunny during the journey from Reihe to sheep camp, but the sky had become cloudy during the night. Now it was raining. Jack and Willie put on heavy rubber boots and stepped out of the restaurant onto the muddy trail. Let's get the water, said Jack. The boys got a horse that was tied behind the restaurant. They attached the sled to the animal and put 2 empty barrels on the sled. Then Jack led the horse along the trail. Willie walked beside him. They had seen many people on the trail from Reihe. Now Willie was surprised to see how big sheep camp was. Willie and Jack passed tents and wooden buildings that contained bakeries and stores. There were hotels and restaurants. There was a drugstore, and Willie saw a sign that pointed to a hospital. Everywhere, people were walking through the mud and rain, and horses were pulling sleds loaded with supplies. There seems to be a lot of bars in sheep camp, Willie said. Yes, Jack agreed, and they are always busy. Jack stopped the horse when they came to a wooden platform beside the river. He took 2 buckets from the sled and tied ropes to them. He dropped 1 bucket into the river. Then he pulled the bucket up and poured the water into the barrel. Willie did the same, and after a few minutes the barrels were full. When the boys got back, the Gold Nugget restaurant was full of noisy customers. While Jack tied up the horse, Willie carried his dishes into the kitchen. Then he helped Lucy wash them. In the afternoon, Willie and Jack again took the horse and sled. This time they went to a little city of tents that was growing along the trail beyond sheep camp. Jack found 2 men who had firewood to sell. They loaded the sled with firewood and paid the men. The rain had stopped and the sun returned as the boys traveled along the trail. Willie looked up at the mountains that rose up around sheep camp. The tops of the mountains were white with snow. There was always plenty of work to do at the Gold Nugget restaurant, but Willie liked it there. His favorite thing was talking with his friends. When he and Jack did errands, they often talked about the trail to the Klondike and all the gold they would find if they ever got there. When Willie and Lucy did the dishes together, they talked about their families and about the places they had lived and the places they would like to visit when their gold rush was over. At night, after the restaurant closed, Willie, Lucy and Jack often played cards at a long table in the dining room. Sometimes Mrs. Stewart joined them, but most nights she was too tired. When they had finished their card games, if the weather was not bad, Willie and Lucy walked to the river. They would quietly talk together or just sit and watch the water. For Willie, these walks were the best part of the day. One afternoon in December, Jack ran into the kitchen where Willie was washing dishes. It was snowing and Jack shook snow off his coat and boots. Willie, we are going up to Chilkoot Pass tomorrow, he said. Mother said we can go if we get water and firewood first. What are you talking about? Willie asked. A man has just hired me to help carry his outfit to the summit, Jack explained. He'll pay $5 to carry 75 pounds and he'll hire you too. Wonderful, Willie said. When do we start? In the morning, Jack said. But let's get the firewood tonight. It'll save time tomorrow. Willie and Jack rose early the next day and went quietly outside. It was cold and dark. They led the horse and sled to the river. The river was frozen on top, so they broke through the ice and filled 2 barrels with water. After a quick breakfast, the boys walked to the Seattle hotel. They found the men who had hired them in the hotel's restaurant. He was eating bacon and eggs and drinking coffee. Mike Price was a tall man with a dark beard. They shook hands. "Please, call me Mike," he said. "I'm glad you can help me. I've made 10 trips to the summit already and I'm tired of going up and down." The sky was becoming pink when Willie, Jack and Mike began to hike up the trail. Each of them wore a heavy backpack. "It's only 4 miles from Sheep Camp to Chilkoot Pass," Mike said. "That doesn't sound very far. The problem is, it's also half a mile up." Over the first 3 miles beyond Sheep Camp, the trail rose 1,600 feet as it went up to a small valley called the Scales, Mike explained. "The last mile from the Scales to the summit, the trail goes up another 1,000 feet, he said. "That's why it's called the Golden Stairs," said Jack. "That's right," said Mike. "That's where you boys will really earn your money." 1 mile from Sheep Camp, the trail went around the front of a small glacier. Willie looked up the blue-white river of ice to where it disappeared into a cloud. As the hikers climbed higher and higher, trees along the trail grew smaller and smaller. Soon the trees disappeared and the trail became a path of rocks and ice, which was surrounded on both sides by very deep snow. At noon, Mike, Willie and Jack reached the Valley of the Scales. "It is called the Scales because people weigh their cargo here," said Mike. "We'll weigh our backpacks so I'll know exactly how much to pay you. But first, let's eat lunch." "I'd rather weigh the backpack first," Willie said with a grin. "I'm going to eat so much that my pack will weigh only half as much after lunch." The Valley of the Scales was crowded with stampeders. There were hundreds of people working to move outfits up the final 1,000 feet to Chilkoot Pass. On the valley floor, Willie saw scattered tents and a few wooden buildings. On the left side of the valley, a thin, dark line cut up across the white mountainside. It was a line of stampeders climbing the Golden Stairs. Mike led the way to a tent that contained tables. He bought a hot coffee and fresh bread for everyone. Willie poured milk and sugar into his cup and quickly drank his coffee. "We have bread, cheese and apples," said Mike. "Who has a knife?" Willie gave him his knife. "This is a good knife," said Mike. "It's German," said Willie. "I got it from my uncle. It was a birthday present." After lunch, Mike led Willie and Jack to a wooden building to weigh their packs. "Your pack weighs 76 pounds, Willie. I'll pay you $4.80 at the top," said Mike. "Jack, yours weighs 76 pounds. I'll pay you $5.20. 10 minutes later, Mike stepped into the line of stampeders at the bottom of the Golden Stairs. Willie was behind him and Jack was behind Willie. Before they had left Sheep Camp that morning, Mike had told the boys to bring strong sticks. Now, as they climbed, they leaned on their sticks and pulled themselves up with each step. In many places, the Golden Stairs really were narrow steps cut into the snow and ice. Everyone in the long line moved up the stairs in the same speed. If you were too slow, the stampeder behind you would shout. If you stepped out of the line to rest, most stampeders would not let you get back into the line. When they were halfway up the Golden Stairs, a cold wind began to blow. Soon it started to snow. Willie could not see the top of the mountain. He could not see the valley below. He just looked at Mike's backpack and took one step after another. Willie's backpack seemed to grow heavier step by step. After what felt like hours, Mike turned his head and said, "Almost there!" Suddenly, Willie's backpack felt a little lighter. The trail began to grow flat. Excited stampeders shouted to one another. After another 50 yards, Mike stepped to the side of the trail. He turned around. "We made it, boys," he said. "Welcome to Chilkoot Pass."